Standing beneath the silent, starlit canopy of Sedona, far from the suffocating press of Silicon Valley, Elias Vance gazed into the immense darkness. At this very moment, somewhere in that galaxy, another civilization might also be looking up at the stars, wondering exactly what this weary man was questioning. Mathematics dictated that they should exist. Hundreds of billions of potentially habitable worlds orbit hundreds of billions of stars within our galaxy alone. Beyond that, there are as many as 2 trillion other galaxies. These realistic figures demand that intelligent life has emerged countless times throughout the history of the universe. However, through the words of his mentor, Arthur Sterling, a quiet but unsettling truth emerged: the universe was not inherently created for encounters. That unease did not merely float in the vastness of space but echoed back from the hollow void within the mind of Elias Vance. Only a few days ago, he was still being crushed within the giant machine of Silicon Valley, where people worship a culture of exhaustion and nurture an arrogant belief that every natural limit can be broken by technology and relentless will. There, we are taught to become data processing machines, always needing to optimize every second of existence, always needing to rise, and always needing to cling to countless invisible networks. Elias had lived such a life, stretching himself thin to fill every scheduling gap with flashing notifications, endless video calls, and expectations that never reached a stopping point. He was certain that immersing himself in that massive flow of data would bring a sense of belonging to something great, rushing at a frantic pace to escape the fear of his own finitude. Yet, the moment of collapse arrived not in a loud crisis, but in a quiet night within a smart apartment glowing with screen lights, where thousands of connection notifications were still pouring in, but Elias found himself drowning in a cold solitude and utter emptiness. That sense of depletion was so brutal that it stripped him of the ability to take a deep breath and took away the notion of who he truly was among the tens of thousands of phantom versions he had created. We often fall into an invisible trap of the era, where being present everywhere means not truly being present anywhere. When the mind is forced to stretch its octopus tentacles to touch every corner of a flat world, we strip away our own gravity and drift into aimlessness. It was this internal fracture that drove Elias to grab his keys, step into his car, and drive in a prolonged state of unconsciousness for hundreds of miles through the night of the barren desert to find the hidden wooden hut of his old mentor, Arthur Sterling. He fled from the algorithms that imprisoned him, yearning to find an answer, a first-aid remedy for the chronic illness of a mind gasping for air because it was forced to become infinite. Under this sky, unpolluted by artificial light, the speck of dust named Elias finally began to face the truth: his ultimate suffering did not stem from not doing well enough, but from trying to force a small life to operate in a way that broke every natural law of the vast universe, attempting to embrace infinity within a finite form. Arthur leisurely poured a cup of hot herbal tea and pushed it toward Elias, letting the delicate steam rise into the desert cold as a first soothing touch for a cracking soul. The old man slowly took a sip of tea and began to mention the great discoveries of the Kepler Space Telescope. He spoke of the time that telescope stared intently at a single patch of sky for 4 long years just to count the faint streaks of light passing in front of stars. The results it brought back shook the entire human consciousness by finding not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of planets. That data proved an overwhelming truth: on average, every star in our galaxy nurtures at least one planet orbiting it. The universe turned out to be incredibly generous in creating new worlds. The number of planets in our galaxy could exceed 1 trillion. The space that seemed desolate was actually crowded with great spheres of rock and gas. However, Arthur lowered his voice, his steady gaze piercing through Elias' fatigue, explaining that this abundance is the source of the most brutal illusion humans have ever set for themselves. It is the illusion of redundancy. Just because the night sky is brilliant with billions of existing planets does not mean we can set foot on them, touch their surfaces, or claim ownership over any world. We stand from afar admiring the infinite, but we mistakenly believe we have the power to control and capture that entire infinity. In a calm voice with the resonance of a Zen master, Arthur gently dissected his former student's pain. He pointed out that the modern society Elias was submerged in also operates according to the mechanism of a similar illusion. Silicon Valley and glowing screens have opened for us a digital universe with tens of thousands of opportunities, millions of virtual connections, and countless scenarios of instant success. We scroll through thousands of lives and thousands of relationships on social media every day and believe we are connected and living fully. We are hypnotized by the massive numbers of likes, followers, or attractive investment invitations, imagining we can grasp them all. But just as we cannot cross tens of thousands of light years to embrace a star, we are completely helpless in containing those thousands of virtual relationships and opportunities within one small life. Elias' misery, an exhaustion to the point of running dry of the sap of life, did not stem from a lack of ability, but from the tragedy of using a finite entity to try and swallow infinity. We turn ourselves into starving guests at a giant feast, constantly reaching out to pick up everything while forgetting that our stomachs have a very modest capacity. When we constantly chase after redundancy, we lose the true presence right where we are standing. Having too many choices does not bring freedom. On the contrary, it forges invisible chains that bind the mind to chronic anxiety and nameless panic. Existence does not promise physical contact. The abundance of the universe does not guarantee intimacy. The lesson of nature is clear and distinct, yet the human mind stubbornly refuses it. We torment ourselves for not being able to be everywhere, not being able to answer every message, and not being able to seize every opportunity. Like water in the vast ocean, the abundance of billions of tons of water was not created to satisfy the thirst of one individual, but to nourish the entire ecosystem. Taking a small cup to the sea and weeping because you cannot bring the whole ocean home is the root of suffering. Our minds are the same. They are designed to savor each moment and experience each connection authentically, not to become a massive data center containing millions of emotionless fragments of information. Arthur smiled a smile of empathy and tolerance, evoking a deep self-reflection in Elias' piece has never been about trying to collect enough stars in the sky, but about knowing how to let go of the fantasy of possession to truly feel whole with the warmth of the teacup in his hand. The universe creates life with breathtaking generosity, but simultaneously places each individual into a limited box of space and time. Escaping that box through greed is a desperate and meaningless effort. Instead of reaching out to grab a trillion worlds, true liberation is gently pulling back your hand, closing your eyes, and realizing that your finitude is not a flaw, but a beautiful privilege that allows us to experience this life most deeply. Elias sat in silence, his gaze slowly shifting from the cold, tense edge of a man always on guard to the softness of someone beginning to learn how to lay down his weapons. The first lesson was not the effort to reach further, but the courage to admit the limits of one's own hands, so that the tattered soul might have the chance to be bathed in the pure tranquility of reality rather than a shallow existence drifting among countless distant illusions. The campfire crackled as it bit into the dry wood, casting a warm glow on Elias' face, which still bore deep lines of contemplation as he carefully set his empty teacup on a nearby rock. The silence of the desert night seemed to create a safe shell for the former student to expose his deepest wounds. He choked up as he confessed about failed romances and the suffocating feeling of standing among millions of people in a bustling city yet being unable to find a single person who truly understood him deeply. Elias always carried a profound fear that loneliness was a disease, a punishment for his inadequacy in maintaining relationships. Arthur Sterling only nodded slightly, picking up a small twig to poke at the glowing embers, causing tiny sparks to fly into the air and blend into the star-studded background before he slowly presented a hypothetical problem. He told Elias to imagine that among the billions of worlds out there, the universe had actually nurtured 10 technological civilizations active at the same time right in our galaxy. If we spread those 10 civilizations across the 100,000 light-year width of the Milky Way, the mathematics of three-dimensional spatial distribution would yield a harsh result. The average distance between the two nearest neighbors would be about 11,600 light-years. That concept exceeds every imagination of the human mind because even light, the fastest thing in the universe, would take 11,600 long years just to cross that spatial rift. A greeting sent and a response received would create a communication delay lasting more than 23,000 years. The old professor looked directly into Elias' eyes with deep affection and emphasized that these distances are not a metaphor for loneliness, but a physical reality. No matter how common intelligence may be, the vastness of space ensures that each intelligence reigns in a deep isolation. The cold distance between stars is not a mistake of the Creator or a punishment, it is simply a fundamental law of nature. In the lens of psychology, humans also possess a structure similar to the vast universe. We are, at our core, entirely solitary beings drifting in the space of our own subjective perception. No one can completely step into another's inner world, nor can there be absolute empathy without the gaps of difference. Elias had tormented himself by viewing loneliness as a disability that needed to be cured immediately at all costs. He exhausted himself to fill that void with shallow encounters, social nods, and forced laughter at parties, only to find the void expanding even more when night fell. Arthur gently explained that when we stop resisting this natural isolation, stop assigning it negative meanings, and begin to accept it as a necessary quiet buffer, all anxiety and despair will automatically vanish. Just as stars need thousands of light years of empty space around them so they are not torn apart by gravity or incinerated in catastrophic collisions, humans also need spaces of utter solitude to maintain their essence. Solitude is the fresh air for consciousness to breathe and for the soul to rest after the weary bustle. As Elias began to see the distance between himself and the world not as a dividing abyss, but as a necessary quiet background for all things to shine freely, he suddenly realized he no longer bore the burden of pleasing everyone or forcing anyone to understand his entire being. That vast distance was not born for us to desperately rush to fill, but exists as an invisible protective embrace, reminding us that we are allowed to stand alone, allowed to be still, and allowed to be whole. Within our own unique universe that the campfire dimmed slightly as Elias shifted, looking into the dark space between the stars and asking aimlessly that if we knew of each other's existence, why could we not just step forward to close that distance? His voice still held the stubbornness of a man accustomed to solving problems through action, familiar with the Silicon Valley mindset that every boundary can be blurred with enough effort and technology. Arthur did not answer immediately but deliberately picked up a handful of dry sand from the ground and let it slowly flow through his fingers into the invisible darkness. He explained that the interstellar void is not merely an absence, but a physical presence, an environment with characteristics that are extremely harsh and hostile to anything attempting to cross it. That great void contains, on average, only about 1 atom per cubic centimeter. To visualize this, the air in the room we breathe every day contains approximately 25 quintillion molecules in the same equivalent volume. Yet, that ultimate emptiness does not mean absolute safety. Interstellar space is a silent battlefield constantly bombarded by cosmic rays, high-energy particles accelerated from ancient supernova explosions that always sneak through every gap in the light. Floating there are also microscopic dust particles composed of silicates and carbon, drifting with an unbelievably low density. At ordinary low travel speeds, these hazards can be somewhat managed, but when an object tries to accelerate to fill the distance, that empty space immediately turns into a destructive trap, ready to tear everything apart at a terrifying speed. Any collision would release a massive source of energy, destroying the protective shell and crushing the material structure within. The old philosopher paused for a beat to let the firelight illuminate the stillness forming in Elias' eyes before he skillfully folded that cruel cosmic message into the complex psychological structure of a human. That hostile interstellar void is a perfect metaphor for the haunting gap lying across our burning desires and our existing reality. In modern life, humans always carry an internal hole, a sense of deficiency that always urges us to act incessantly, to rush out into the world to find something to patch that missing spot. We often mistakenly believe that the gap is gentle and empty, just waiting for us to bring business projects that exhaust our strength, the applause of the crowd, frivolous fame, or even clinging to toxic relationships to fill the surface. But in reality, when we discard our own quiet anchor and desperately hurl ourselves into that silent void at a frantic pace to quench our loneliness, we are entering a hostile environment without any support. The more we exhaust ourselves rushing toward the illusions of our desires, the more violently we collide with the microscopic dust of judgment, the radiation of envy, and the invisible pressures of a society that always demands extreme perfection. Like a solitary ship entering the silent darkness without an internal energy source, our minds will quickly be eroded, punctured, and torn apart by the very harshness of the emptiness we stubbornly try to conquer. That void is unyielding. It reacts to the very greedy velocity we impose on our lives. Elias gradually realized that his recent months of exhaustion and the constant panic in his mind were the direct consequences of blindly rushing into that void without any defense. He had turned himself into an object drifting aimlessly in a psychological space full of hostility, voluntarily exposing himself to exhausting pressures without knowing that the inner void was not born to be filled by mismatched pieces from the outside. It exists to create a space for settling, allowing us to clearly see the nature of desire instead of closing our eyes and rushing in a drunken stupor of paranoia. Accepting the choice to stand still, breathe, and observe that void from the sturdy shore of reality, rather than entering the hostile trap of greed, is truly the source of the most sustainable liberation, bringing the mind back to its original state of peace without needing to borrow anything from the crazy world outside. That the darkness surrounding Sedona's canyon seemed to thicken as Elias swallowed hard, shedding the burden of hurling himself into the hostile void. Yet his mind still clung to a deep-seated habit from Silicon Valley of fierce belief in being able to accelerate to overcome all barriers. Recognizing that subtle struggle, Arthur gently steered the story back to 1905, when a young patent clerk named Albert Einstein published the special theory of relativity, forever shattering the illusion of being able to conquer space with speed. The old philosopher calmly explained that the speed of light is not at all a road marking or a deterrent suggestion, but a sturdy structural property of space-time itself. It is an uncompromising absolute limit, confirmed by every experiment in the history of physics, a great wall built with the fundamental equations of all things. Any object possessing mass, whether a speck of dust or a giant spaceship, can never reach that wall. However, the tragedy of Elias, as well as so many people struggling in this era of constant optimization, is that we arrogantly refuse to believe in the existence of absolute limits. We are infected with a toxic religion that glorifies a fanaticism for productivity, where people are taught that the human mind is a machine that can be continuously overclocked, and that with just a bit more time management skills and iron will, we can cram countless tasks, thoughts, and ambitions into the same narrow moment. We deceive ourselves that the processing speed of the brain and the endurance of the body are infinite. But just as the universe will violently resist every effort to accelerate near the speed of light, nature also punishes the arrogance of the mind when it is constantly whipped to run faster and do more. The overthinking, the chronic sleepless nights, and the exhaustion to the very roots that Elias was suffering from were not signs of weakness or lack of effort. On the contrary, they were the screams of a finite being crashing into the structural wall of its own limits, refusing to accept the natural boundaries of the body and soul, while always yearning to push oneself beyond biological and psychological limits, is actually a desperate resistance against the laws of creation. We turn ourselves into prisoners of our own false desire for freedom, destroying our essence by forcing it to follow unreal speeds. Arthur's whisper blended into the desert wind, carrying a gentle antidote admitting helplessness before that wall of speed is not a humiliating surrender, but a sacred awakening. When we stop struggling and stop punishing ourselves for not being able to go faster than the frantic cycle of the world, we begin to learn how to cherish the natural heartbeat of our own lives. True liberation does not lie in inventing more powerful engines to break limits, but in a graceful surrender to the primitive rhythm of life, allowing the mind to walk instead of having to sprint on a path that never has a finish line. Elias half closed his eyes, feeling a strange relief spreading through every muscle as he realized the wall of limitation was not born to imprison him, but to protect him from self-incineration in the fire of ignorant arrogance. The silence caressing the desert leaves seemed to soothe Elias' heavy shoulders as he touched the truth about impassable boundaries. But Arthur Sterling knew his student still needed a deeper surgical remedy to truly uproot the exhaustion. The old professor picked up a small pebble, rolling it between his thin fingers, and then pensively dissected a consequence even more brutal than the speed limit: the effect of relativistic mass increase. He explained that the universe does not just set up a barrier, it reacts with a violent friction from within the object's structure. Natural law dictates that when approaching the speed of light, an object resists the force of acceleration as if it has doubled or tripled its mass, eventually requiring infinite energy. This is not a technical flaw that can be glossed over with intelligence, but a mathematical law as cruel and solid as the sandstone cliffs surrounding them. Arthur's gaze softened, seeing through to the very bottom of Elias' weariness, bringing a sharp metaphor to perform a spiritual surgery as a first aid for exhaustion. He slowly pointed out that in the psychological equation of our era, the ego is that mass. When we live a slow life in harmony with the natural flow, our ego is very light and graceful, just enough for us to perceive our own existence. But when we are caught in the frantic whirlpool of a hurried society, constantly pressing the gas pedal to rush toward illusions of recognition or brilliant success, the mass of the self begins to increase in a forced manner. Nature has very clearly stipulated that the more we try to rush toward the illusions of society, the more our psychological burden expands, exhausting every source of life energy. Every new expectation and every new label we paste on ourselves adds a terrifying weight to our psychological mass. The exhaustion Elias and many of us bear is not actually due to a lack of energy or lack of resilience. That bone-deep fatigue is the inevitable consequence of trying to use the small biological energy of a human to drag an ego mass that has been inflated to infinity by the acceleration of greed. We turn ourselves into cumbersome spaceships screaming as they run out of fuel in empty space just because we are trying to catch up with illusory models we can never reach. The most cruel illusion of self-development doctrines is that they always urge us to seek new energy sources and drink stimulants for the soul to continue accelerating, without realizing that the acceleration itself is the enemy creating the weight that crushes the sap of life. The philosopher's tone suddenly became incredibly soft, like a cool stream washing away the dust of years of blind competition. Arthur whispered a simple yet powerfully liberating truth: tranquility begins with taking your foot off the gas. When we stop forcing ourselves forward at all costs and stop building massive shells for the ego, the mass of the self will automatically shrink, returning us to a primal lightness. All friction with reality suddenly vanishes when we no longer try to tear the fabric of space-time with the arrogance of will. Elias let out a very deep sigh, feeling as if the 1,000-pound rock pressing on his chest for all these years was gradually crumbling and vanishing into thin air, giving way to a pure emptiness where he no longer needed to become someone great or hurry to be allowed to exist peacefully under tonight's sky. The lightness just blooming in Elias' chest suddenly faltered as he realized that even if the ego were shed, the invisible pressure from the flow of time still seemed ready to swallow him. Understanding that subtle disturbance, Arthur Sterling continued to lead his student deeper into the miraculous workings of the universe by teaching about time dilation. The old professor's deep, worn voice echoed in the stillness, describing a paradoxical physical phenomenon. For those on a high-speed ship, time actually slows down, but for the universe outside, time still flows fully. On that ship, the crew might only experience a few decades of stillness, but outside, centuries have forever passed by. The Voyager's greatest fantasy is believing they can deceive the universe, but the truth is that distorting subjective perception does not change the price of reality. Space and time never grant discounts just because we feel they have shortened. With a sharp philosophical vision, Arthur gently shone the light of that truth into the dark corners of modern human psychology, opening a metaphor for how people abuse invisible neurological stimulants to escape reality. We often lock ourselves in high-speed ships called social media, short entertainment videos, or endless news feeds to bathe in a rain of cheap dopamine. We immerse ourselves in them to distort our perception of time, making hours pass as if in the blink of an eye just to hide from the terrifying stillness of the present. We imagine we are succeeding in compressing pain and compressing the dullness of mortal life. Yet, the universe outside does not stop spinning. While we are intoxicated with the subjective speed of digital illusions, the real world and the flesh and blood people around us are still bearing the full weight of the flow of time. And then, when we look up from the screen, when the ship of distraction is forced to stop, the truth is revealed brutally: we have lost true connection with those around us because of the desynchronization. We return to reality after a hollow dopamine journey only to realize with horror that loved ones have changed and every relationship has become strange. The trap of that cognitive mismatch robs us of the only gift creation bestows, which is true presence in this very moment. Elias fell silent, listening to the crackling of the wood, realizing that every effort to flee from boredom through the speed of distraction was actually a great theft where the thief was himself, stealing the most precious stretches of time from his own life. Arthur's teaching was like a graceful bell of mindfulness ringing in the desert, calling Elias to awaken from the delirium of the era, reminding us that peace does not lie in finding ways to bend time to pass quickly, but in the courage to step off the ship of illusions, relaxing the mind so that feet truly touch the ground and the heart's beat synchronizes with the slow, quiet breath of the vast universe. As the shock of stolen time still lingered in Elias' eyes, Arthur Sterling continued to make him face another cruel physical boundary. One that drained the last bit of life from dreamers who believe will can bend all natural laws. The old professor used an empathetic gaze to look deep into the student's exhaustion, calmly presenting the hopelessness of dynamics and exposing a terrifying reality about the price to pay for forcing oneself beyond limits. He explained that for a spaceship to reach 50% or 90% of the speed of light, it would require a massive amount of energy exceeding the total global electricity production for many years or even the output of an entire star. That ultimate cruelty is dictated by the rocket equation, a cold physical principle that mandates an object must carry fuel to push the mass of that fuel itself. Any ship carrying stored energy must bear the mass of its own fuel, which also needs to be accelerated along with the entire passenger cabin. This creates a deadly loop. When you add fuel to push the ship forward, you immediately need more fuel to push the fuel you just added, then need an even larger energy source just to carry the next amount of fuel, creating a binding whirlpool with no end. In the stillness of the desert, The crackling of the fire seemed to accompany the professor's deep sermon as he borrowed that hopeless physical principle to shine a light of mindfulness into the psychological darkness of modern man. Arthur exposed a painful truth: the toxic self-help methods of this era are smiling falsely while constantly teaching us how to drain ourselves. We live in a culture manipulated by calls to awaken potential, giant ambitions, and dogmas of productivity optimization, imagining those are sacred energy sources to reach the stars of brilliant success. We stockpile harsh advice and megalomaniacal goals like giant fuel tanks attached to the mind. But tragically, just like the helplessness of that cosmic equation, the mass of those massive expectations becomes a new burden that crushes life. The more we force the mind to carry unrealistic desires, the more we consume invaluable life energy just to maintain those pressures rather than truly stepping on the path of self-understanding. Most of us are exhausted and drained to the point of panic, not because the road of life is too difficult or because we work too much, but because we are bending under a cumbersome belief system where every effort to pump an illusory motivation only increases the weight of torment and self-deprecation. We burn our own souls to nourish illusions. Elias blinked, feeling an invisible but heavy boulder slowly sliding off his tired shoulders as he realized that his long-term exhaustion did not stem from being a weak individual. He was merely the victim of a flawed psychological equation that blindly drained life to provide fuel for irrational fantasies to please a society that never knows enough. True liberation never lies in desperately seeking other transcendent energy sources or trying to cram more forced effort philosophies into an already crowded brain. Absolute peace lies in the courage to let go of the cumbersome fuel tank of fantasies, dismantling the unrealistic expectations, crushing the heart to realize that existence itself, still in this moment, already carries within it the most complete and peaceful beauty. When we stop trying to be spaceships carrying endless ambitions to reach far away, we truly allow ourselves to return to being original humans, breathing the atmosphere of the present fully and finding true freedom right within our own small limits without needing any more brutal thrust. That the fire in front of Elias was now only glowing embers, radiating a quiet warmth into the desert night after he cast off the burden of the invisible fuel tank. Though his mind was much lighter, deep in the subconscious of a man who had tasted many broken things, there still remained a dull pain about relationships that had passed through his life, about people he always thought he had lost just because of a mismatch in destiny. Feeling the flow of thought circling in his student's head, Arthur Sterling spoke again in a steady voice, carrying the wisdom of one who understood both the universe and the human heart, to offer a thought experiment that broke all prejudices about connection. The old professor asked Elias to imagine a giant apartment building containing 10,000 apartments spread over 500 floors. In that great building, you know for sure there are other residents because occasionally you still hear bustling sounds echoing through the cold walls. However, a very ironic paradox is posed: each resident in that building only returns and stays in their own apartment for exactly 15 minutes throughout an entire long year. They come and go at completely random times with no scheduled itinerary, no contact directory, and no signs to predict. Your 15 short minutes might fall at 3 in the morning on a cold Tuesday in March, while your neighbor's 15 minutes right next door descend on a sunny Saturday afternoon in October. You could live in that giant apartment building for decades without ever having the chance to meet another soul. That ultimate solitude occurs not because the building is empty, nor because those neighbors do not exist, but simply because the windows of time each person is present are too short and randomly dispersed so that the chance for two 15-minute intervals to overlap is almost a solid zero. Arthur smiled an empathetic smile before gently shifting the lens of that temporal apartment building toward humanity's eternal torment about the phrase "right person, wrong time." In the vast galaxy, temporal dispersion is the cruelest reason why civilizations, even if they exist, cannot find each other among the 13 billion-year history of the universe. And in the microcosm of human psychology, that law operates with no less cold precision. We often punish ourselves, agonizing to the point of panic when a relationship breaks, believing we were not good enough or missed a perfect half because of mistakes in a moment. We blame fate when we meet a kindred soul, but at a stage where both are carrying different priorities and burdens. But the truth the temporal apartment building reveals is that harmony between two people in this changing life is not at all an obligation that we have the right to force to happen. Each of us carries different psychological time zones, different wounds in the process of self-healing, and growth trajectories that are not at all synchronized. Two lives coincidentally stepping into the same inner room, opening up and ready to receive each other in the same moment of life, is a magnificent random miracle of time, not a result that can be arranged by will. The mismatch between people is not a punishment or a mistake to be corrected, it is merely the manifestation of an unavoidable law of dispersion. As Elias listened to those disentangling words, he suddenly felt his chest relax in a strange way, as if a fragment that had once pierced deep into his heart was finally being gently pulled out. He realized that letting go of regret for those who had passed through his life did not mean denying the feelings once held, but was an accepting embrace of the random nature of destiny. Instead of blaming the mismatched windows of time, we are now allowed to breathe a sigh of relief and cherish to the end the short moments we were lucky enough to truly be present with someone. In the same sacred 15 minutes among the endless flow of time. As the serenity from understanding the random windows of time replaced the deep torments in Elias' mind, Arthur Sterling looked up at the Milky Way stretching across the brilliant night sky and continued to lead him to face another aspect of time, the absolute impermanence of human life. The old philosopher used a calm voice with the resonance of a meditative song to sketch a breathtakingly contrasting picture between the greatness of the universe and the smallness of humans. He reminded Elias that the Milky Way embracing them has resiliently existed for 13 billion long years, a duration exceeding all limits of imagination. Meanwhile, the entire technological civilization that humans are so proud of, the civilization that gave birth to the frantic whirlpools exhausting Elias, has only uttered its first cry of birth for barely 2 centuries. Arthur offered a soul-shaking comparison. If we compressed the entire 13 billion-year history of the Milky Way into a single calendar year, the entire existence of human technological civilization would occupy only a tiny fraction of the last thousandth of a second before the stroke of midnight. That great disparity was not offered to trample on human self-esteem, but served as the sharpest spiritual surgical remedy to help Elias completely change his lens on impermanence. Our modern minds are always besieged by the illusion of eternity, always exaggerating every personal problem, turning professional failures, judgments, or minor wounds into grand tragedies. With the weight of the whole universe, we cling to attachments, nurture pain, and yearn to maintain everything forever, forgetting that under the gaze of ancient stars, all ultimate suffering or the most brilliant glory of a human life is, in the end, only a flickering spark flashing for a moment and then forever extinguished in the pitch-black night. Perceiving this cruel yet magnificent truth, people often tend to fall into a state of panic, struggling before the void of human existence. Yet, Arthur smiled, transmitting a pure liberating energy into the space, advising Elias that instead of letting that brevity drown him in a pit of despair, he should use the very transience of life as the most legitimate reason and the most beautiful privilege to allow himself to completely let go of petty grudges and unnecessary anxieties gnawing at the soul. If our existence is just a lightning bolt flashing through the infinite flow of time, then carrying the weight of petty hatreds, frivolous ambitions, or calculations of gain and loss is surely a ridiculous waste. Awareness of smallness does not strip life of meaning, it liberates us from the giant burden of having to be great, needing to be remembered by the world, or needing to control all things. It reminds us that this life is too fragile and short to be for anything other than inner peace and compassion. Elias sat in silence, listening to the beat of his heart in his chest, feeling a freedom never before known flowing through every vein. He realized that the illusion of eternity was the most brutal prison confining humans in chronic anxiety, while accepting the role of being a small spark happily burning brightly in one's own short present moment without caring about the fade-out was the pinnacle of liberation, bringing the soul back to a state of absolute stillness and peace within the vast universe. As the preoccupations with the vanity of life were blown away by the desert wind, leaving a quiet space in Elias' mind, Arthur Sterling gently lifted his thin arm, pointing toward the myriad stars scattered across the black velvet vault. The old professor began to slowly sketch another miraculous picture of creation, containing the truth about the lifespan and survival rhythm of each star. He explained that although from afar they seem to twinkle identically, each of those cosmic nuclear reactors actually carries a completely different mission and life cycle. There are A-type stars with massive mass, burning brilliantly with a dazzling blue light but consuming fuel so quickly they are depleted and fade in less than 2 billion years. They are magnificently great but burn too fast, causing the habitable zone to shift constantly, so any orbiting planet does not have enough time to nurture a complex ecosystem. At the opposite extreme are the small and dim red dwarfs, accounting for 70% of the population in our galaxy. They burn reservedly and economically to the point where their lifespan can extend to 10 trillion years. However, that longevity comes with a brutal price. The habitable zone is so close to the star that planets are locked forever with one side facing their sun, enduring radiation disasters from violent firestorms that can strip away the entire atmosphere. Every star in that sky, whether great or small, brilliant or faint, possesses its own window of time. They cannot swap places, nor can they force themselves to shine in the way of another star. With a tone steeped in sorrow for the exhausted souls, Arthur gently raveled that beautiful astronomical principle into Elias' inner storm, into the chronic disease of comparison gnawing at modern society. In Silicon Valley, as anywhere in this high-pressure world, we are constantly crammed into a single model of success, forced to race on the same temporal runway. We torment ourselves to the point of depression when seeing others reach career peaks in their 20s or 30s, sentencing ourselves as failures. When not finding a peaceful harbor at the age prescribed by society, we carry the burning desire of a brilliant A-type star but force ourselves to maintain the 1,000-year stability of a red dwarf, and then blame ourselves when roasted in crises of burnout. Arthur's explanation was like a warm stream seeping into every crack in Elias' soul, removing the burden of toxic comparison. The philosopher reminded us that human life also carries a magnificent diversity identical to the celestial entities out there. There are people born with a hurried pace of evolution, shining brightly in a short phase and then choosing to step back for stillness. There are also people who need to go through decades of silently accumulating energy, patiently crossing the darkness before truly finding the most brilliant light of their lives. Our trying to force a partner, a colleague, or ourselves to evolve at the same pace as the illusions around us is a coercion contrary to the laws of nature. Elias closed his eyes to let his breath harmonize with the sound of the desert wind, feeling the bonds of social metrics peeling and falling away. He no longer saw himself as a disappointing, out-of-sync version, but realized he was simply a star moving exactly on the unique orbit and time frame belonging only to him. That realization brought a sense of ultimate liberation, where we no longer have to look anxiously at someone else's sky to check the brightness, but only need to gently embrace all the ups and downs, the dark intervals, and the bursts within the finite window of time that creation has bestowed, thereby finding complete peace in being oneself among myriads of different stars. As the gentle light of self-sufficiency just shone into the narrow corner of Elias' mind, Arthur Sterling pensively stroked the rough surface of his cool teacup, preparing to lead his student into a perspective more brutal than ever to completely end the addiction to mental travel. The old professor used a sad but clear voice to tell of the most rigorous scenario of the desire for cosmic connection, where a civilization receives a distress signal from a star system 4,000 light-years away. They put all the essence of generations into building a ship, launching it at a speed of 5% of the speed of light, accepting a long voyage lasting 80,000 years through the infinite void. However, after crossing oceans of darkness and enduring radiation and the erosion of time, what welcomed them at the destination was only a bone-chilling silence. The atmosphere of the planet that once emitted the signal had completely changed. The deep blue oceans were now only a thick brownish red from anaerobic microorganisms, and the civilization that once called out had been forever erased tens of thousands of years ago. The miserable travelers spent 80,000 years of their lives only to dock at a giant tomb of a species already extinct. There was an equally heartbreaking scenario where they arrived to find the planet still overflowing with green life, but the intelligent species once existing there had long since vanished, replaced by mindless creatures unaware of the great works that once reigned on the ground. They arrived too late or perhaps too early, completely missing the window of time where connection could occur. Arthur's gaze at this time pierced through Elias' newly sprouted shell of calm, shining directly on the wounds of the heart still bleeding from unending nostalgia. He gently spoke to perform surgery on those pains, pointing out that the cruel cosmic scenario was the truest mirror for modern humanity's habit of self-torment. Our minds are also spaceships constantly making desperate journeys back to the past or straight into the future. We consume the precious life energy of the present to swim against the current of time, trying to anchor in relationships that have withered, people who have changed, or glorious moments that are now only the ashes of the past. We knock on hearts that have changed, waiting for a response from an inner civilization that has long since collapsed, only to receive the ultimate disappointment and pain when realizing the other is no longer the person we once knew. Or conversely, we exhaust our minds and bodies building perfect future scenarios, imposing strict expectations on ourselves and those around us, trying to reach an illusory shore of happiness that never existed, sliding along non-existent desires. We constantly lose the precious present just to chase the ghosts of yesterday and the illusions of tomorrow. Elias felt a tightening in his chest when realizing how long he had locked himself in an aimless flight, wasting the life sap of a human existence to seek stopovers already erased by the flow of time. Old figures, past mistakes, vanished glories, all were only faint light signals emitted from dead stars, taking thousands of years to reach his retina today. The whisper of the old professor carried a supreme healing energy, advising him to bravely cut the energy source supplying that mental voyage ship. True liberation does not lie in trying to fly faster to catch up with the past or head off the future, but is the decisive awakening to step down from that desperate flight, letting go of the obsession with illusions no longer present. When we stop being out of sync with ourselves, stop demanding the past live again and the future follow our will, we can anchor our feet firmly on the ground of reality, fully enjoying every breath of the present, the only place where life, connection, and true peace can sprout and grow. That the first morning light shone through the red sandstone cliffs of Sedona, waking a new day and bringing a delicate mist drifting on the silent desert surface. Elias paced beside his mentor Arthur Sterling, his chest much lighter after leaving behind the mental voyage ship of the previous night. However, deep in the subconscious of a man raised with the pride of technology, there still flickered a final spark of hope, unconsciously asking whether the great progress of science and technology in the thousands of years to come could break all limits to close the cosmic distance. The old philosopher stopped, standing on a precarious ledge overlooking the wide canyon, and used the most fundamental law of physics to deliver a gentle but decisive blow to that final illusion of control. He slowly mentioned Hubble's law, a shocking discovery indicating that our universe is not at all static but is incessantly expanding. This expansion is not like galaxies moving away from each other. Rather, the very space between them is stretching itself in every direction. And the cruelest thing about space-time geometry is that at large enough distances, the cumulative stretching of space causes distant galaxies to recede from us with a velocity exceeding the absolute limit of light. This creates an invisible but incredibly solid wall, an eternal boundary that no technology and no great energy source in the future can overcome, because you cannot outpace a road that is stretching longer than even your most hurried steps. The light from galaxies beyond. That boundary will forever be unable to reach us. They are imprisoned outside the event horizon, forever out of reach. With a tone steeped in tolerance, Arthur borrowed that ultimate expansion wall to perform surgery on the roots of the modern mind's megalomania. We are nurtured with a toxic religion of relentless effort, where preachings always affirm that you can have it all and control everything if you try hard enough. It is that illusion of omnipotence that has turned us into exhausted slaves, always tormenting ourselves when unable to change others, unable to save a relationship that has ended, or unable to reverse an event already settled. We panic and resist unchangeable truths, like trying to use bare hands to pull two galaxies together in a constantly expanding universe. The truth is that this life always contains absolute boundaries, events, and people forever lying outside our circle of control. Arthur's teaching did not bring pessimistic despair, but on the contrary, it lit the torch of absolute acceptance, untying the soul from the burden of paranoia. When we recognize and bow before the geometric truth of spacetime, admitting that helplessness before some pieces of life is not a failure but an inevitable part of human existence, the tension in the mind suddenly vanishes. We do not need to play God in our own lives, nor do we need to bend over backwards carrying responsibility for things outside our own event horizon. Letting go of the illusion of control does not make us weaker. It brings an infinite relief, a sacred privilege allowing us to stop, breathe, and serenely return things that do not belong to us back to the vast flow of the universe. Elias stood silently on the cliff, letting the early wind caress through his hair, feeling the last stubborn technological spark of hope shatter into 100 pieces, but instead of being let down, he found himself floating in a pure freedom never before known, having finally been allowed to remove the crown of the illusion of omnipotence to return to being a small, still, and peaceful human before the ultimate expansion wall of all things. The morning sun had now gilded the red sandstone slabs of Sedona in a layer of brilliant gold, clearly sketching the stillness on Elias' face after he cast off the burden of ultimate control. However, Arthur Sterling knew that for this liberation to truly take root in the consciousness, he needed to take the student to the very end of the truth about spatial expansion. The old philosopher gently directed his gaze toward the far horizon, where the clear sky was without a single cloud, and whispered about an invisible force called dark energy. He explained that the expansion of the universe does not maintain a steady speed, nor does it show signs of slowing down due to gravity as science once mistakenly thought. On the contrary, under the invisible hand of dark energy, that expansion is accelerating frantically. The consequence of this great acceleration is that our event horizon is actually constantly shrinking. Those distant galaxies are not just retreating further, they are being pushed across the boundary of light to then forever slip away into the aimless void as if they never existed. There will come a day in the very far future when the night sky seen from any planet will be only a silent black color, with no neighboring spark left to admire because all things have been absolutely separated. In a warm and compassionate voice, Arthur shone that irreversible isolation scenario onto the most wounded corners of human psychology. Throughout our lives, we are always pursued by a primitive fear of loss, always struggling with our hands to hold on to everything from mindless objects and faded glories to relationships already drained of life. We act as desperate collectors, believing happiness is always proportional to the number of things we can keep by our side, refusing to let anything go. We cry and torment ourselves to the point of collapse when a friend leaves, when an opportunity is missed, or when a beautiful time forever closes, only to lock ourselves in the prison of nostalgia. Yet, the universe, through the cold but incredibly real operation of dark energy, has sent a sacred message. Parting and disappearance are the core essence of every existence, not a punishment for any individual. Elias closed his eyes tightly, listening to each teaching steeped in wisdom, feeling the invisible fingers that had been clenched in his mind for years gradually loosening. He understood deeply that trying to preserve all things, struggling against the fading of relationships, or stubbornly holding on to blurred shadows was actually a delusional fantasy going completely against the nature of the space-time flow. Creation did not grant us the ability to hold on forever, because even the greatest galaxies containing billions of brilliant stars must follow the law of drifting and vanishing. Ultimate inner peace never comes from building solid ramparts to protect what we love from the decay of time, but flows from deep understanding and absolute courage to allow things that have crossed the limit to depart in a final serenity. When we stop struggling and stop weeping for the lights that have crossed the event horizon of our lives, we truly liberate ourselves from the prison of attachment. Instead of drowning in the pain of loss, we learn to stand firmly in the present, sending a respectful farewell into the silent void and smiling gratefully because at least in one short moment of our life trajectory, we were lucky enough to intersect and admire each other's light before all things continued their infinite drifting journey. The permanent isolation brought by dark energy was no longer a death sentence for the desire for connection. Magnificently, it had transformed into a strict teacher, teaching us the art of letting go with compassion so that the soul could truly return to its most empty, light, and peaceful state. That the morning sun had now brilliantly illuminated the entire Sedona Valley, sweeping away the last remnants of darkness. And at the same time, Arthur Sterling prepared to light a final torch of awareness, to clear the thick fog in his student's mind. The old professor, with the leisurely manner of one who had fully understood the law of impermanence, slowly gathered the 6 invisible physical walls that the teacher and student had dissected throughout the night, including the immense spatial distance, the absolute barrier of the speed of light, the brutal price of energy, the narrow finitude of time, the short survival windows of stars, and finally, the cold expansion of spacetime. At first glance, all 6 of these laws combined seemed like a life sentence imprisoning humanity in an ultimate solitary prison, stripping away every opportunity for civilizations to touch each other. Yet, Arthur smiled a smile as bright as the morning light, embracing them and deliberately revealed the most beautiful paradox of creation. He clearly explained that the 6 harsh barriers supposedly creating suffocating isolation were actually the greatest blueprints, the supreme laws born to protect and maintain life. Imagine if the universe did not have the giant wall of distance, if stars were right next to each other so we could easily visit. Just one supernova explosion from a neighboring star would be enough to release a dose of radiation, sweeping away the entire atmosphere and incinerating all life on the scale of an entire galaxy. If the speed of light were not limited and space did not expand incessantly, the hot primordial plasma of the early days would never have had the chance to stretch and cool to condense into the first atoms, nebula clouds, or the solid rocky planets for us to lean on. That great distance is not the cruelty or indifference of nature, but a perfect architecture, an absolutely safe shell to nurture the incredibly tiny seeds of consciousness. With a deep, healing energy, Arthur directed a compassionate look toward Elias, reflecting that cosmic mirror into the fragile structure of human psychology. Throughout his years submerged in the bustling Silicon Valley, Elias, like so many other modern people, had always blamed his own limits, viewing fatigue, lack of time, and the brain's finite capacity as defects needing to be overcome at any price. We yearn for infinite power to embrace all things, yearn to blur every boundary to connect with the whole world, without knowing that those very biological and psychological limits are the cradle protecting the integrity of a human being. Just as the Earth needs tens of thousands of light-years of empty space to be saved from cosmic radiation storms, our minds also immensely need solitude and clear boundaries so as not to be swallowed by the chaos of the world outside. If we truly had the ability to absorb all information, empathize with every pain, and meet all expectations of everyone around us, our unique essence would immediately be crushed and evaporated under the terrible heat of endless demands. We strip away that sacred armor when we force ourselves to open every inner door to receive distracting information flows, toxic trends, and relationships that erode life force. The universe took the trouble to build 6 great walls to protect your inner kingdom, but you yourself tore them down just out of fear of stillness and panic before loneliness. The teaching of the wise mentor was like a waterfall washing away all worries, affirming an ultimate truth: human finitude. Helplessness before the flow of time, or smallness before a noisy crowd are never weaknesses preventing us from reaching happiness. On the contrary, in reality, they are the vital prerequisite conditions for the existence and growth of a healthy soul. Those limits create an invisible but firm and durable boundary, preventing the self from being dissolved into nothingness, keeping the flame of life burning gently in a space of the right size instead of flaring up violently and then going out in a flash. For the first time after countless long nights of being paralyzed by the pressure to be perfect, Elias truly felt a deep gratitude welling up toward his own weakness and narrow limits. He understood fully that the separation in the soul, though occasionally bringing a sense of desolation, was an invaluable solitude, a magnificent privilege bestowed by creation to protect his original core from the destruction of a boundaryless, spinning world. That brilliant perception was like a miracle, cleansing all self-deprecation and completely resolving the resentment toward the imperfection of human existence, leaving in the chest of the man once full of wounds an infinite serenity and peace, knowing that he is always cherished and safely protected within the finite arms of this great cosmic structure. That the sky of Sedona was now completely clear and brilliant under the dazzling morning sun as Elias slowly stood up, stretched, and took a very deep breath while looking at the vast blue space overhead. Every burden once crushing his mind seemed to have been swept away by the desert wind, returning a soul completely still and empty in the purest way. He fully realized the final truth that Arthur Sterling had worked hard to convey: creation constructs life in distant isolation, not stemming from cruelty or cold indifference, but because of an incredibly deep and perfect mathematical structure that allowed all things to take shape. The quiet but beautiful truth is that this great universe was not designed for noisy encounters, but was created to evoke ultimate wonder. Elias, as well as each of us, has now fully grasped a life-liberating lesson: it is completely unnecessary for us to reach out to touch everything in this world, no need to bend over backwards to close every distance or desperately try to catch up with the pace of a spinning society. You only need to serenely stand at your own window of life, dwell within your own finite but incredibly sacred limits, and use your whole heart to admire the brilliant reality manifesting right before your eyes. The profound life lesson and core human value that this journey brings is the art of letting go of the illusion of omnipotence to embrace the impermanence of human existence, soothing souls exhausted by perfectionism. The great value of a human being is not measured by how far we reach or how many things we control, but shines through the ability to tolerate and cherish our own fragile smallness, as well as that of the beings accompanying us in this vast universe. When we know how to bow before absolute limits, we truly know how to love all things freely and can shed the wounded shell of a heavy ego. If you feel your soul soothed and find resonance through this awakening journey, please press the subscribe button for our channel, like, and share the video so we can listen together to many more attractive and profound videos every day. We immensely cherish and wonder how you feel about this story and how it relates to the pressures and anxieties in the real life you are bearing. Please open your heart and share your comments and sincere thoughts from the depths of your heart below so we have the opportunity to listen, understand, and share the hardships with you. We send our best wishes to everyone watching this video. May you always have abundant health, a joyful life every day, peace, and always maintain your inner stillness amid the crashing waves. Goodbye, and see you all in the next video.